Welcome everybody. I'm just having a look. We've got a good number of people in here. Welcome for those who came last week and to other Tech Grey Rhino events. And welcome to anybody who's this first time to a Grey Rhino event. Just to summarise what Grey Rhino is about, Rhino IT recruitment and Darwin Gray commercial corporate solicitors felt that we should be giving something back into the tech community in which we operate within. And so we put the Grey Rhino collaboration group together. It has 4 key objectives, but one of them is sharing of knowledge, sharing of ideas up and down the tech ecosystem. And that's taken place in the form of meetups that have taken place over last year and the beginning of this year so far. And obviously with the lockdown, we want to still continue in that theme, and I've been doing these webinars with furlough coming in, and a few of my clients both having to furlough staff and asking me, have I got any experience of it? Can I introduce anybody who knows anything about furloughing? I thought this event would be a good way to just share knowledge. So Tegan, who's a corporate and commercial solicitor at Darwin Gray, managed to rope in Fflur Jones, who is the employment law specialist and partner at Darwin Gray, focusing on that area. So the way we'll set this up today is I'll hand over to Fflur in a few moments. Fflur will go through the information and the talk itself. We'll then go into a QA session where she can go into a bit more detail around specific questions. Fflur's also said that if she's not able to get the answers, she'll try to get those answers in a write-up to you, and the write-up will also be provided to everybody via the meetup group later on, or just message me directly if you're not in the meetup group. And then after the QA session, we'll sign off. I'm aiming for about 45 minutes. If it runs over, please do forgive me, and you can sign off and we won't take offense. So without anything more from myself, I'm going to hand over to Fflur. Fflur, as I said, heads up the employment law department at Darwin Gray Corporate and Commercial Solicitors. She's a subject matter expert when it comes to employment law, and I am very grateful for Fflur taking the time out of a busy schedule to deliver this talk. Over to you, Fflur. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mo, and thank you all for joining. I'm here obviously to talk about the furlough and the coronavirus job retention scheme. It's obviously a sad day that we have to discuss these things, but sadly in the current circumstances, we're lucky that the government has put this scheme in place. So just to touch base first of all on what the basics are in terms of the coronavirus job retention scheme. Now, people have been bandying the word furlough around, and furlough in fact is an American term which basically describes what happens when this coronavirus job retention scheme is put in place. It basically applies to all employers across the UK who have got a PAYE scheme. So as long as you've got members of staff who you pay through PAYE, then this scheme is eligible for you to participate in. And basically it applies to any employee who was on the payroll on the 28th of February 2020. Now, you can see I've put the employee there in brackets, and that's because basically that means anyone effectively who's on the PAYE scheme on that date. So whether they're a worker or an employee, they count as someone who can actually take part and are eligible to have the benefit of this scheme, provided they were on the payroll on the 28th of February. The 28th of February date seems a bit arbitrary, doesn't it? But it's basically there to try and stop fraud happening effectively so that people can't use this scheme to introduce people who may not have been part of your business prior to that date, so that people basically it's focused on those who are properly on your payroll from that date onwards. So in order to be furloughed, you have to basically be doing no work for your employer because of the COVID-19 crisis. And that's the key thing to remember with this scheme, is basically that if you are still able to work in any capacity for your employer, or if you are an employer and you're thinking, you're looking critically at your staff members and thinking about who's able to do what work for you, if anyone's doing any work for you, then this scheme doesn't apply. But if they are sat at home, unable to work because of the nature of their jobs, they're working in a manufacturing sort of scenario, or they're doing something manual, which means that they can't actually assist you from home, or if they're maybe doing admin work and actually your administration tasks have been reduced massively because you're working from home, then those people aren't able to work for you, and therefore they're doing zero work, which means that effectively you can apply for this scheme. And what it means is that you basically can then apply to HMRC to get reimbursed for 80% of their gross wages from the 1st of March onwards. So it's retrospective back to the 1st of March as well. The good news is, and this is something that's come up a lot when I've been advising on it, is that basically people have been worried if they've got blocks of people who do the same work, and there's still a requirement for some of that work to be done. So the question has been, well, how do I choose people? Who do I choose to put on furlough, and who do I hold back to keep working for me? Because the people have been feeling that if you say, well, this group of people are going to still work for us, but we're going to furlough the rest, will that lead to resentment and so forth? The good news is that you can actually rotate people, and as long as they take furlough leave in 3-week blocks. So effectively, if you've got a group of people who are doing the same work for you, and you might have 6 people, for example, and you still need 2 to do the work, you could then rotate who goes on furlough leave in that 3-week block or longer, obviously, if you needed to. So that means that everyone can basically keep having a bite of the cherry and keep working, but also can be put on furlough so that others can work. And I think that's very important as well from the mental health aspect of furlough leave, which is something that's exercised me quite a lot, because I think for lots of people, working is so important to them, to give them meaning and to give them a reason to get up in the morning. And therefore, this is a really good way of sharing the pain, in a way, of putting people on furlough leave so that they effectively can only be off on that furlough leave for a short period of time. The reimbursement is also subject to a monthly cap of £2,500 plus employers' national insurance and auto-enrolment pension contributions. So 80%, so it's 80% of salary, unless you earn more than £2,500, in which case your salary will be capped at that level under the scheme, which is not a bad thing, I think, given that so many people are taking part on it, and it's going to take the government a lot of money to fund it. So what do employers need to do? They need to decide which employees are not required to work and need to be furloughed. So that goes back to my point. If you've got a group of people who are effectively all doing the same type of work, and you only need a certain number of them to keep working for you, then you need to work out how you're going to select those people, and bearing in mind, obviously, that you can rotate those people as well. So that's the first thing, and that's quite hard. It's quite easy, obviously, if you've got particular people doing particular jobs, then you can just select those people. So, for example, if you've got a pool of people doing admin work and you no longer require that admin work to happen during this period of time, then you can select all of those. But if you've got a bigger pool of people, then you've got to be a little bit more imaginative about how you select those people. And when I say imaginative, what I mean is, obviously, you need to have an objective criteria for selecting those people. So some of you may be familiar with the way we select people for redundancies, for example, or if you are deciding to introduce changes to people's terms and conditions. So in those circumstances, you will select an objective selection criteria and apply it to the group of people who are affected by it. Another very important principle is that you must agree the furlough with the employee once you have selected those people who are to be furloughed. So this is not something you can impose on people. You have to get their agreement to it. Now, most people aren't going to put up a fight, because they're going to know that this is better than the alternative, and the alternative will be their redundancy. And not very many people in this climate will want to be made redundant. So I don't think that you will find people are resistant to it. I mean, obviously, it's a 20% reduction in salary, or possibly more if you earn more than £2,500 a month. But effectively, you should be able to get that agreement quite quickly. And we've developed a template letter that we suggest to our clients to roll out to employees so that they can use that for this purpose. Then basically you've got to keep paying your furloughed employees the lower of the 80% of their normal monthly wage, or £2,500 a month, because at the moment this scheme isn't exactly up and running. You will all be aware, obviously, that the government are scrambling to try and react as quickly as they can to this crisis. And of course, Rishi Sunak's announcement a couple of weeks ago was very welcome on this furlough scheme. But ultimately, it's not actually set up at HMRC properly yet. So what you have to do is declare in your payroll run who are you furloughing, and then basically you've got to keep paying them and try and get a rebate when the scheme is up and running from HMRC. So that's actually a practical consideration for you. You must decide whether you've actually got the cash flow in place to keep paying people until such time as this scheme might be up and running. So that's something to bear in mind, because if you don't, then you may have no choice but to go down the redundancy route anyway. As I say, apply for that reimbursement when it's up and running. And one thing I've been advising people on is lots of people have been concerned about whether, if people are at home looking after dependents and therefore unable to work, whether they can be furloughed. And the guidance isn't explicit on that, but I think our interpretation of it is that you could indeed put those people on furlough leave, provided that they have basically gone on unpaid leave post the 28th of February because of their dependent requirements. But of course, this is an application for reimbursement. So if that's incorrect, then HMRC will tell you so. So you just need to make sure you've got contingency planning in place so that you could actually bankroll effectively those employees anyway. Do keep up communication with furloughed employees, but you can't allow them to work. So obviously, as I said, this goes back to my mental health point earlier. Most people find working gives them a massive sense of purpose, a sense of wanting to get up in the morning, and a sense of duty. So it's quite a shock to lots of people when they are furloughed. So keeping up those communications are very important. It doesn't mean that they do any work for you, obviously, but check in with people, make sure they're okay. If you're able to rotate it, all the better, because that means that everyone shares a little bit in the pain. Just some questions now on furlough that we've been given, which I thought might be helpful for you to consider. So employees can be furloughed for only part of their working weeks. The answer to that is no. An employee on furlough leave must do no work at all during the period of furlough. So effectively, it's all or nothing. And I think actually with hindsight, the government might regret this, because lots of people probably have got some work that they could still do. It's rare that, well, unless you're a cabin crew and your entire flight capability has been grounded, most people will still be able to do a little bit of work. But the fact is, with this scheme, is that you cannot do any work at all. So it's not a case of doing part-time work or anything like that. Otherwise, if you're an employer, you will not be able to claim the reimbursement of their wages. And you should monitor this very carefully and ensure your employees are not working from home for you. It sounds quite simple, doesn't it? But it's almost like, how do you define work? Lots of people effectively just think, well, is it okay for me just to keep fielding my emails, for example, because that's not really doing work. I'm just keeping an eye on what's going on. But if you're actually doing that and you're answering queries, for example, then you might want to tell your employees who say that they want to keep doing that they shouldn't, because that's something that they probably shouldn't be doing. The difficulty HMRC are going to have is how on earth are they going to police this and monitor it? They're going to be massively under-resourced, and I think we'll probably see investigations into these kinds of things for very, very many months, possibly years to come. Obviously, the bigger your group of staff or your numbers of staff, the more likely it is that you will be facing more scrutiny. But I'm sure once HMRC catch up with this, they will be wanting to be very careful about it due to the huge cost associated with running the scheme. So how do you calculate 80% of monthly wages for employees whose pay varies from month to month, for example, for casual workers? Now, this is a question that's exercised us quite a lot. And the answer is that HMRC guidance is that the employer should use the higher of the employee's monthly wage from the same month last year or their 12-month average earnings. So if the employee has not been on the payroll for 12 months, then this would be their average monthly earnings since they started. So a little bit in the way that you calculate holiday pay and so forth, you look back, you either go on the higher of what their wages was last year, or you look at what their 12 monthly average earnings is. So it's not an exact science. It's quite a difficult thing to get right. But ultimately, HMRC are sort of acknowledging the fact that this is something that employers try and get right. And obviously, it's important that those people get some money if possible. So hopefully that's helpful for you. Now, lots of people have been asking us about holiday. Does holiday continue to accrue during furlough leave? Well, yes, it does. Absolutely. Nothing stops you accruing holiday, just in the same way as it does for people on maternity leave or long-term sickness absence. Now, there is no reason to stop you asking your staff from taking holiday during their furlough leave, for example, however. That would obviously be at 80% of their salary. But if you think about it, once this is over and we've all had a big party, we'll all be returning to work and we'll be thinking, gosh, you know what? The first thing I want to do is go on holiday. So if we all suddenly start taking holidays at the same time, that's actually going to prolong the pain, isn't it? So it's not a bad idea, particularly if you've got lots of people who are affected by the furlough leave scheme, to ask some of them to take holidays during this time. It's a bit tough because obviously people are stuck in their houses. They can only go out once a day to exercise. But, you know, you never know. Some people might be wanting that time off just to recover, to take stock about the situation, to do some spring cleaning, to do some trying on of clothes that they haven't tried on for a long time, etc. So it's quite sensible to introduce that, I think, particularly if you've got lots of people involved and who are affected by it. So can employees be furloughed without their consent? You'll remember in my last, in one of my previous slides, that that's absolutely not the case. You must seek people's consent unless you've got a temporary layoff clause in people's contracts of employment. Now, most of you won't have those clauses in them. When I started practicing employment law back in the 90s, gosh, that seems like a long time ago, there were lots of layoff clauses in contracts of employment because of various recessions that had happened, and people had understood that this was quite a useful clause in those periods of time. But over the time, employers have got quite complacent about that, thinking that, you know, layoff is not going to happen unless you're in sort of manufacturing or engineering sort of scenarios. So you should check your contracts in case you've got that layoff clauses in there. But if you don't have that, then you cannot furlough people without their consent. But obviously, if you keep paying them 100% of their salary, then it's no hardship to them. And again, therefore, you could do it without their consent. But people who are going down to 80% of their salary, or the higher, or the £2,500 cap, will need to give you consent. Now, a lot of questions have been asked to us of how to consult with people before seeking that consent. In normal circumstances, if you've got a great deal of employees affected by this, then you would consult fully and thoroughly, and probably for more than 30 days. Sadly, people's cash flow mean that this is not so easy to achieve in the current circumstances. So we've been saying to people with less than 20 employees to do the best they can. And obviously, if you've got more than 20 employees, to try and do a slightly longer consultation. But employees need to understand that the alternative of this is basically their redundancy scenario. So on the whole, people, my experience have been that employers have not had too much trouble with the consultation process. So what happens if a furloughed employee develops COVID-19? And this, unfortunately, is going to happen at certain times to all of us, isn't it? Well, staff need to tell you if they've got symptoms of COVID-19, or if they're medically advised to self-isolate because someone else in the household's got symptoms. This is because, well, once they've got COVID-19, they will be put on SSP instead of furlough pay. So you do need to make sure people tell you what their status is, how well they are, etc. Because not only is that important for fact gathering to see how the illness spreads through the population, but also because, in fact, they don't have the right to be paid furlough leave once they're ill. They're either going to be on SSP or on your company sick pay scheme. So how do you deal with disputes about which staff should be furloughed? This goes back to my point about the rotation and how some people may find that they are disgruntled, that they're the ones having to work, whilst others are, as far as they're concerned, sitting at home watching Netflix. So, as I said earlier, you've got to have an objective selection process. If you've got people who are feeling low because they're having to keep working for them, you've just got to keep chatting to them, reassuring them, and try and think of ways possibly to incentivize them. So, for example, you might say, look, when this is all over, I'll give you an extra 5 days holiday to make up for this. You know, your support is very much appreciated. Thank you for helping us during this difficult time. But that rotation thing obviously helps a great deal as well to try and share the pain of this, particularly if you've got jobs that are capable of being shared amongst lots of people. So there's no easy answer. I'd like to think that people are not going to be silly about this, because everyone understands that, in fact, not one of us want to be in this situation. But you still do have moments and elements of resentment. And all you can do is try and make sure your tech solutions are up and running so you can communicate with those people as well as possible. What is the likelihood of a challenge from HMRC if an element of government funding is received? So we've already touched on this slightly, haven't we? It will depend basically what proportion of an organisation's funding is coming from public funds and whether this money goes directly to staff costs or not. If it doesn't, and it only makes up a minority of an organisation's funding, the organisation will have a good case for furloughing its staff, but should do so responsibly. So basically, if you've got any government funding or funding from a third-party provider, you need to check with that funder that it's okay for you to maybe suspend the terms of your funding in order to be able to furlough your staff. So you shouldn't do that without communication with your funder. I mean, we've had elements, for example, where we've been advising people who get, for example, Arts Council money. And there's been very open dialogue with the Arts Council to say, look, you're giving us core funding. Some of that we pay towards our staff salaries. Is it okay for us to furlough them? Because they can't actually do anything productive for us at the moment. Thankfully, in those circumstances, and for example, the Arts Council have been very understanding, but you do need to have those conversations so that you don't then look at possible challenges from HMRC. And obviously, some people can be redeployed to help others in other roles. So if you've got people with transferable skills, consider whether you might be able to use them in a different capacity. Again, you need to consult with them because that's going to be a change to their job responsibilities. But effectively, it's something that's sensible to do. And ultimately, we've all got a responsibility, haven't we, to try and keep the economy moving during this time. So to the extent that we can be productive, we should try and be productive. So in terms of timescales, how quickly can we implement this? You should start consulting with staff on furlough straight away and start their furlough leave immediately if they agree. So obviously this is a scheme that's backdated to the 1st of March. So lots of employers will have already taken this staff, and we are hearing in the news, obviously, more and more all the time that people are choosing this option. The most substantial case yesterday was British Airways, obviously furloughing thousands of staff. So there's no reason to stop and to wait for the HMRC payments to be up and running. All you need to do is inform through payroll that this is what's happening and how many members of staff and who exactly are being furloughed. And those people, as long as they agree, can go and be furloughed immediately. If furlough is beyond 1 month, does redundancy entitlement kick in? No, at the moment, there's no maximum period for furlough and there's no automatic trigger points for redundancy. So this is something that's been exercising a lot of people's minds. It's basically, at the moment, the government have said the scheme is going to be in place for 3 months, but with a likelihood it will extend further than that. So as long as you've got cash flow or reserves to possibly pay out redundancy payments at the end of any furlough period, it can continue as long as the furlough entitlement continues. So there's no sort of steady answer to that. Some companies, sadly, have already said, well, even if we furlough people, we're not going to have the cash to survive this at the end, so we're going to just make people redundant. But what the government are trying to do is avoid those scenarios at all costs and try and keep people so that they're in their jobs, ready to rock and roll as soon as this is over, so that the economy kickstarts itself as quickly as possible once we are out of lockdown. So what form does consultation with members of staff need to take? Well, you can start the process by sending the letter I mentioned earlier. And as I said, we've got a template we've developed for that purpose, which sets out the proposals that you're intending to take, and asking them to confirm their agreements. There's a slip at the end of the letter which they can return to you, or they can email you to tell you that they're happy with what you're doing. If they don't agree straight away, then you can follow this up, obviously, with a longer consultation process, which could be done through calls and virtual meetings and emails. Again, I'd like to think that most people will be sensible about this. I suppose some people may say, well, I don't accept that I can't do any work from home. I've got the ability to do some work remotely. I've got my laptop or I've got my desktop, or I'm able to make calls or whatever. So those people, I guess, could potentially be a little bit reluctant. But on the whole, people will know that actually just suffering a 20% reduction in their salary is not bad form, given how many companies, particularly in the retail and entertainment and tourist industry, that are basically ground to a complete halt. What notice would we need to end the furlough process with the individual member of staff? Well, there's no minimum period, but obviously the principle in all employment law scenarios is that you must act reasonably. it's not really reasonable to give someone just a day's notice of return to work, is it? Especially if they've got childcare or dependent care arrangements. I would say that in most circumstances, possibly a week could be sufficient. But obviously, if you've got something that you think, oh gosh, we need to really get on this quickly, because as soon as the lockdown is over, we can actually start moving. We can start preparing food for people, or whatever you're doing, or we can open the cafe. Then obviously those people should maybe expect to hear from you with less notice than a week. Again, you might want to actually tell people at the outset what notice you're likely to give people, and make sure that people keep in communication with you so they don't turn their emails off, or you've got their mobile numbers and you can text them and so forth. So can furloughed employees get involved in community volunteering not related to their paid occupation, but using company vehicles, such as delivering food or medicines? Well, yes, they can indeed, as long as they're not providing services to or generating revenue for your organisation. I had this question the other day. There was a group of tech staff that a client of mine were thinking of furloughing, and they were approached by the NHS to provide their services to set up a field hospital up in North Wales. The organisation was very keen for them to do that if they wanted to volunteer, and obviously most of them were very happy to do so. But then there was a question mark whether the organisation could charge any money for their services to the NHS. And the answer very much was, no, you certainly can't, because that would be generating revenue for your organisation. And I think actually they also could see that that could potentially be a bit of a PR disaster for them, in the sense that no one wants to be seen to be profiteering from this dreadful situation. Volunteering for other organisations in the community obviously is fine, and those people who are fit and well, in fact, should be actively encouraged to do that, because obviously very many organisations and businesses are actually flat out trying to provide services in these difficult times. If you want to let them use your company vehicles, then obviously that's a business decision. I think most companies would be glad to allow that to happen. But obviously you just need to check your insurance policy to make sure that private use of the vehicles is allowed, because otherwise you might need to make some adjustments to those insurance policies. What documentation or evidence should we have in place when managing furloughed working? Well, once again, communication and the written record of it is king here. You should keep copies of all letters and emails you send to staff as part of this consultation process, or as part of your communications with them, because effectively, if you do face an investigation from HMRC, what you will need is a good paper trail to show people, show those people investigating you that you've effectively told people what you're expecting of them, what you're not expecting them to do, i.e. work, etc. Explain to them how this impacts on their terms and conditions and so forth, and just make sure that, you know, everyone is completely in the clear about what this means for them. And do, as I say, keep in touch with people and follow this up with your furloughed staff every 3 weeks. It may be that you're rotating people anyway, which will make it easier. But, you know, it's not the case if you're a business owner or an employer that you just turn off and go, right, I furloughed those members of staff. I don't need to worry about them until this is over. That's not the case at all. You do need to keep all your paperwork in place and have good justification for all the business decisions you've taken. Because obviously, like in any employment scenario, if you've got the paperwork to support your decision, it makes your chances of getting rid of any investigations and so forth, or coming through them successfully, far better. So those were the questions that we've sort of come across on a regular basis. Now, I think some of you have asked a few questions, so I'll try and have a look at those now so I can answer those. If Mo possibly tells me how to access them.
Yeah, thank you, for that was amazing. Also, as well, just you've mentioned a little bit about well, you touched on some of the employee side of things, holidays, when they need to return to work, can they do other work in the meantime? Is there any other points that should be brought up if you're a person that's been furloughed? Things that maybe I haven't thought of that is important.
Sorry, repeat that last bit.
So are there any further points that should be raised if I'm a furloughed employee? Is there something like more that I should know? You touched on a lot of them already, I imagine. But anything else that may be important for me as a furloughed employee? And I'll bring those questions up as you're answering that.
Fab. Well, the first thing to make sure, obviously, is to tell people who are unfortunately furloughed that they can't do any work for you. As I say, some people go, fab, I get to watch Netflix all day, but it's actually more serious than that. They really can't do any work for you. But you also need to tell them, look, this is not us washing our hands of you. We know this is tough for everyone. If you want to reach out and have a chat with us, you must do so. Obviously, you need to touch on the holiday and what happens with that, and whether you're expecting people to take holiday during the furlough and so forth. And also how people will be worried about their other obligations under their contracts of employment. So possibly provide people with copies of their contract so they can be reassured that all of the terms other than their pay are completely preserved. So it's about keeping communications going effectively and making sure that people understand and know that you're not abandoning them. You're there to try and keep this ship going so that when the time comes and once we've had that big party, everyone's back working and we get the economy moving as quickly as we can.
Got you. Okay, thank you, Fflur. If you go into chats, the questions are there, but I'll read one question out for you, and it's been seconded by two people. This is from Craig and Enqui, I think it is. The question was, can company directors be furloughed?
Company directors, can they be furloughed? They can, provided they're employees. So that's the big thing. Are they paid through payroll? Lots of directors will be paid a mixture of PAYE salaries plus dividends. So sadly, some people just pay the £8,000 maximum that you pay through PAYE without incurring the tax liability, in which case, obviously, you'd only get 80% of that. And because it doesn't affect dividends at all. But if you're paid normally as an employee, but you're also a director, then certainly you can be furloughed.
Okay, I think that answers the questions. If not, please drop it back in and I'll go through it.
Yeah.
Next question is from Tony G. He wants to know what if his rights haven't been, what are his rights if the process hasn't been followed by the employer?
That's a very good question. And in fact, I've had a few cases already where employers have been slightly unscrupulous and have cut corners and have not consulted and so forth, and certainly not sought people's agreements to it. If that's the case, you may be able to say that your employer has breached your contract of employment, which would entitle you to effectively resign and bring a claim for constructive and fair dismissal against them. So, for example, if you're furloughed, but you haven't given their consent, or you believe that you shouldn't have been furloughed, but your employer is being unscrupulous and they've effectively just furloughed you because they're just wanting to conserve money, but you've actually got work that you could be doing, then you could say, this employer is not doing the right thing by me, and I'm going to look down the barrel of resigning and bringing a claim for constructive and fair dismissal. Now, obviously, that's a very drastic step to take, and most people would be worried about doing that because they would be thinking, well, that means I won't have a job. So on what am I going to live? So I think the chances of people doing that is quite slim. But obviously, you could raise a grievance about the situation with your employer. And in fact, I would actively encourage you to do so, because the government's guidance is quite clear that even though you're furloughed, employers can still deal with ancillary matters such as grievances and disciplinaries whilst you're furloughed. So that would be certainly the first thing you would do. If it's the case that you've been dismissed instead of being furloughed, and you believe you should have been furloughed, then you might have a claim for unfair dismissal, or certainly, as one example I've had recently that I've just been dealing with their case, this person was dismissed on the grounds of redundancy, but wasn't paid redundancy or notice pay a couple of days before the furlough scheme came in, And obviously we are advising her that she's been unfairly dismissed. So there's very many options, but if you're still in work, the first thing to do would be to raise a grievance.
Okay, thank you, Fflur. Another question I've been asked is, we were advised that you would only be able to claim 80% of the £2,500 cap for higher earning employees. So £2,000. Your slide suggests that we can claim the full 2,500. Can you confirm this?
So it's either 80% of salary, or if you earn more than 2.5, then it's capped at 2.5. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. If it doesn't, go ahead, Joe, and ask again. But I think
so if you're earning, if you're being paid £2,000 a month, then you're getting 80% of £2,000 a month. If you're earning £3,000 a month, you won't recover more than £2,500 a month from the government. I think that answers it.
Okay. Income has fallen through the floor, but we still need to support our customers. Our staff skills are not interchangeable, but are still needed for only 50% of usual requirement on a daily basis. We cannot afford to pay both, but if we furlough one and not the other, then our business will fail. Is there any suggestions around that?
That's a really difficult one. So effectively, if you've got work that people need to do, and otherwise your business is going to fall, then this furlough scheme doesn't apply to you because you've got work that those people are capable of doing. Sadly for them, if you've only got them working at 50% capacity though, but that 50% capacity is absolutely crucial to keep your business going, then you've got no choice but to consult with them to change their terms and conditions to give them a pay reduction to reflect that scenario. So that's a difficult one and I think, in a way, as I said earlier, that's one of the problems with this scheme. And to be fair to the government, obviously they were trying to react quickly to a very difficult situation. But I think this provision for not reflecting the fact that some people could still do some work, but employers can't pay their full salaries is probably something that should have been looked at. But ultimately, as I say, if you've got work for people to do, even at a reduced capacity, then you've got to keep them working and just negotiate a change in their terms and conditions to reflect that.
I hope that answers your question, Peter. If not, drop it back in. Question from Brett. First of all, he thanks you, and he says something else in Welsh. I haven't been able to translate, but he said diolch and then afterwards. So I'm not sure what the rest said. But then he says, really useful presentation. Can furloughed employees undertake courses, professional development during the furlough period?
Yes, indeed they can. And in fact, that's something we've been telling people to suggest to their furloughed employees. There are loads and loads of online courses that are available to people. Anything they want to do to encourage and to hone their skills during this period of time, they really ought to be doing that. So you should do that. I mean, as long as it doesn't count like work, but it doesn't, because that's about, I don't think there'll be any problem with that. And I think, in fact, it's actually written into the guidance that you can do that.
Okay, hopefully that answers the question. I've got a private question here, which is asking, what if a company has already been doing badly financially, letting people go, cutting backs, and then is now using the furlough scheme to save on employees? Is there any comebacks to that?
Well, you know, the furlough scheme isn't meant to be a scheme that saves an already troubled economic situation for a company. So we've, for example, advised people who had started thinking about redundancies prior to this situation arising to keep going with that, because it's got nothing to do with it. So I think what those companies who may think, oh, we'll just furlough members of staff now, need to think is, how will they justify that to HMRC when that investigation comes knocking at your door? Because ultimately there's going to be a paper trail, isn't there, of concerns that employers may have about sections of the business or whatever. So you need to be able to think through how on earth would you be able to justify furloughing people in those situations if in fact the situation they're in has got nothing really to do with COVID-19.
Sure. I hope that answers your question. If not, drop it back in. I got a question from Jeremy Abel. He said, could you just go back to the definition of working? Is he safe to respond courteously to emails explaining his position and not answering the questions, but just, keeping that dialogue open with customers, clients to say he's been furloughed? Would that be regarded as working?
I think absolutely everyone needs to keep up being courteous and tell people, but I would suggest that unfortunately what should happen, if a lot of your work is involving fielding emails, which inevitably lots of us who are desk-based do, then I think you need to have an automatic message explaining to people that you've been furloughed and that you will not be checking your emails often, and that you will get back to them when you can, or that their email's been sent on to someone else. It's really difficult, but that's a decision an employer really needs to be aware of when they're deciding who to furlough people. If you've got people who are effectively, it's going to cost your business in the long run that they've all gone completely quiet, and it basically is going to be really detrimental to your business that people can't field emails, then obviously you need to keep that going.
Thank you. Hopefully that answers your question. I've got a question returning back to director's employment from Craig. He said, thank you for the answer, but he says he's not quite sure. He gets to the bottom of the status issue. I was given an example to perform his role of generating bookings, revenues, etc. requires him to work. But if there's no revenue, then the company needs to furlough him. We can't unfurlough employees unless I generate leads that need to be engaging with the client, engaging in being serviced. It's a bit of a catch-22, but I would worry about HMRC investigations showing he worked whilst under furlough, but he would need to work in order to keep the business going. Is that more of a direct question that you can answer to him directly?
Yeah, I'm just looking at it now as well on the screen. So the big question with furloughing, whether someone should be furloughed or not, is whether they're able to do any work. So if you are performing a role of generating bookings and revenue, means that basically you're working, you can't be furloughed. So if you're doing that, then you are not eligible yourself to be furloughed. The rest of your members of staff might well be able to be furloughed, but you can't because you're working. So it's not about how much revenue is generated or anything. If it's the case that you are still capable of working, but the company has no means to pay you, then unfortunately, then you're looking at a redundancy situation. So I don't know if that answers the question, but the big decider is if you're working in any shape or form, then furlough is not for you.
Hopefully that answers your question, Craig. Joe Stiles says thanks. Mark asked, and I think this is a nice easy question, if we were to be paid $3,000 a month, would we not be paid $2,400 as 80% of salary is lower than $2,500? So is that right?
Wait a minute now. I'm trying to work that one out. So it's yes, I think that's right, isn't it? If your 80% salary comes in at less than 2.5, then you're going to be paid the 80% of your salary. Is that right? I'm questioning myself now. Can I come back to you on that? I've got myself all confused. Sorry. I'll come back to you on that.
Sure thing. Yeah. And I've just done the maths. 2,400 is 80% of a £3,000 salary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't remember whether it's the high. No, I think it's the higher of, isn't it? It's up to a maximum of 2.5. No, it will be. Sorry, it's going to be 80% of the £3,000. So it's going to be the lower of that. So yes, you're right. It's going to be 2,400 rather than the 2,500 you'd get, because yeah, that's right.
Sure.
It obviously the government wants to pay the least out. So the 2,500 would only apply if, for example, you were on £3,500, which means that 80% would be more than 2,500. Yeah, that's right. Sorry, it took me a little while to get there.
Sure thing. Thank you, Fflur. Another question from Jeremy Abel. I think Fflur said that the BA employees were furloughed, but I thought they had been temporarily laid off. Am I right?
Yeah, I think they were. There was a mixture there. There was some of them were laid off because they had layoff clauses in their contracts, so they could be done so. But I think, but also some people were furloughed, so it was a mixture, as far as I understand.
Okay. Another private question's coming. I think there's a private question going over to you from a member in this group. So if you could have a look at that, there's a private question there. If not, I can put you guys in touch directly. And then Jeremy just said, not a question, but I'd like to thank Fflur and all for getting involved. That's great. And Craig replied, yes, thank you. Yes, it does answer his question. So thank you very much for everybody who attended. I know that we had about 30 odd at peak, so obviously.
Sorry, my cat has just come across my table. Sorry.
I didn't notice, Claire.
Sorry, she's just come in and she's thinking she wants some food.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Don't worry. Well, I went off the camera because my son came in.
There we go.
So no worries. I want to thank everybody who took part. I hope it's been useful. And again, the Grey Rhino Tech Talks are all about collaboration, sharing knowledge, sharing ideas and information up and down the tech ecosystem. And this is just a live version of what that looks like at a difficult time. We're all supporting each other. Again, Fflur, thank you so much for making the time available. I know we ran over it as well. I said 45 minutes, so I thank you so much. It's so interesting, so informative, answered all the questions and more, and gave me a lot to think about as an employer as well. Tegan, I don't know where you're gone, but Tegan is also a big thank you to you for putting this together and thinking about the idea and putting the whole speakers and the talk together. I want to appreciate the work you've put into this. And if there's any other questions, please do drop them back into the meetup talk group. Sorry, and I'm just looking. Nope, there's one question saying, do I get in touch directly? I'll put you and Fflur in touch together directly at the end of this. I'll share Flur's email address with you. And
and we can certainly share the slides as well.
Yeah, and you can do that. If you share that with Tegan, she can drop it into the group through Anna. And if you can if you do a write-up, we'll share that as well.
No worries.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And we'll sign off now. And Fflur's from Darwin Gray, Corporate and Commercial Solicitors, Employment Law partner. Reach out to her with any direct questions. You feel free. And get a few people asking, can I be put in touch? So I will do that. Yeah, I'll put everybody in touch. Fflur, would you mind, or I'll get it off one of the other members. I'll get your email address. And I'll share it with them who are asking to be directly contacted with you. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you all for listening. And I hope it was useful to you all.
Okay, stay safe, everybody. And we'll probably catch you next week with another talk. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.